You're listening to the Mind Your Own Business podcast, aimed at helping photographers learn how to make the leap from amateur to pro. Hello and welcome to the Mind Your Own Business podcast, a joint effort brought to you by Photofocus and Skip Cohen University. This is Shamir Young and I'm joined by my tropical co-host, Skip Cohen.
Oh, everybody already, if you've listened to this podcast before, all of you know already that I make fun of her for living in cold climates, and Florida doesn't get much more tropical. But the fun of Florida right now is the snowbirds have all gone home, and you don't have to eat dinner at 4 o'clock just to be able to get into a restaurant if you decide to go out. So the tourists are gone, and it will now be relatively quiet in South Florida until December. So it goes from spring to December, and it's
Love
quiet.
It. All the Michigan people.
Yeah, you got it. They've all gone home. Meanwhile, this is a great podcast we got today, and I'll bet you would like me to intro our guest.
Oh, I'm excited. Let's do it.
Yeah, I'm psychic. Hey, the fun of this industry, and I've said this and written about it so many times, it's all about the friendships. Now, somewhere around 10 to 12 years ago, I was based in Ohio, and our guest today, Terry Clark, was based in Pittsburgh. And that's just a couple hours drive away. Now, he had the high bid on a fundraiser donation. I don't even remember what it was for, but it was 2 hours or an hour of my time for marketing support. So instead of doing the traditional phone call back then, because nobody was playing around with Zoom, Molly the Wonder Dog and I hit the road for the day, and we drove over to Terry's studio and just hung out with him. Since then, we've stayed in touch. His images and philosophy about storytelling have been shared a few times on the skipcohenuniversity.com blog. And he is a wealth of insight, having been a photo editor, photojournalist, portrait artist, and now dabbling in education. But most fun today is talking about his journey and a return to film, which is going to be interesting for almost all of you out there. Now, before any of you roll your eyes, believing that nothing believes the convenience of digital, stay with us. Terry's going to share the way working with film changes his perspective and allows him to capture even more emotion in his photographs. So, buddy, this is going to be it. Welcome to Mind Your Own Business. It's time for your lips to move. Is that a good enough cue?
That's a good enough cue, Skip. Thank you very much.
Well, good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Terry, we are so excited to chat with you today. And I mean, your work, it speaks for itself. It really does. And, you know, we want to kick it off with our favorite first question, just so our listening audience can get a chance to know you a little better. Give us kind of your journey, your background information. How did you end up doing what you're doing today? And how did you get started?
Oh, that's a long story. How long is this podcast?
As long as we want it to be.
Okay, well, I started out at the ripe old age of 15, and I was expecting to play football, and I got to start as a center in my school's football team. And on the first play of the first game, the middle linebacker of the opposing team decided that I looked like a really good bridge to the quarterback, leaped as soon as I hiked the ball. I was the center because I was, I guess, the biggest guy on the team and the most uncoordinated. So he leaped up, hit my back. I went into the ground. And the next thing I remember is waking up on the sidelines going, ow, that hurt. And deciding that, no, I was not going to become a football player. And so the next week, I just came back with my dad's camera to be around the football team and, of course, the cheerleaders. So I got to be honest. So I took pictures and sent them off through the drugstore to get developed. And when they came back the next week, my high school journalism teacher, who also happened to be the athletic director, small school, and he said, oh, you should take these down to the daily newspaper and see what they would do. Oh, okay. I'm clueless. I'm 15, remember? So I go down to the newspaper, and they direct me to the newsroom. And this was a small paper. There was only a few people that worked there. But I remember walking in, standing on the landing and looking down into the sunken newsroom, feeling the vibrations of the presses, the smell of the ink, the stale cigarette smoke, and the burnt coffee. And it was love at first smell. I just couldn't get over the whole aroma thing. And then the editor, said, "What?" As editors did at that time. And I walked down and told him my story, and he looked at me like I was, why did I come in here? So he looked at them politely, threw them back at me and said, "This ain't no weekly, boy. This is last week's news." And then he did something totally unexpected. He kicked this camera off and under the desk and said, "If you can load it, you can use it this weekend." Wow. Well, it was a 4x5 Crown graphic, and it just happened to open up the same as my dad's camera, which was a medium format folding camera. So surprisingly, I knew how to open it up and I knew how to load the film. And he looked at me and going, "Great, now I got to teach you how to use it." Well, that started me off in my journey. And I brought the camera back and the film back after the game. They processed the film, and I never forget the first time I ever saw a print, a negative come up, then a print come up, and it was like, wow, this is magic. It stinks down here, but it's magic. Because, of course, the darkroom was in an old coal room, so it wasn't the cleanest place. And he looked at the pictures, and he reached into his pocket and said, "Here you go, kid. You're now a professional photographer. You sold your first picture." And he handed me a $5 bill.
Oh, how cool.
And that was 1970-something. But I was 15, and that meant, like, I was high as a kite. And I said, "This is awesome." So did what any other 15-year-old would do. I, came in the next, Monday morning before they got to work and waited for them. And the editor, who was, he had just retired from the U.S. Navy as a, senior master chief or some high-rank master chief in charge of the combat camera group out of Norfolk, Virginia. And he looked at me and said, "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to work." "Go to school, kid." So I went to school. The next morning I came back, and the next morning I came back, and he finally looked at me and said, "You're not giving up, are you?" He said, and I said, "No, sir." He said, "First off, don't ever call me sir. I worked for a living." Typical non-com answer. Then he said, "Come on in. I'll teach you how to make coffee. At least you got something under there." So he taught me how to make coffee the Navy way, and that was put way too much coffee in the urn and put salt on top and go from there. So that started a beautiful mentorship, friendship, and he basically taught me everything I could ever hope to know about photojournalism, telling stories, everything. So I was really excited. And after I graduated school, he said, "Now what? I suppose you want a job." Going, "Yeah, that'd be great." Since I needed to have money. And he gave me my first real job. And then I started moving around to different newspapers. And at 19, I flew his coop and decided to go north. And the publisher that interviewed me said, "Well, we have 2 openings. Which one do you want?" I said, "What do you mean 2 openings?" "Well, the chief photographer and director of photography just retired or just left, and we have a staff photographer's job." I said, "Which pays more?" And he said, well, the director of photography position pays more. I'll take that one. So at 19, I became a director of photography for a newspaper group in Big Rapids, Michigan, way up north. And I was at that point the youngest director of photography in the country, from what I understand. So
Wow.
it was a fun journey. And from there, I just went on from job to job to job to job and honing my skills and learning more, and eventually went to college and went to Ball State University. And the only reason I went to Ball State was because of one professor named Joseph Costa, who was a legendary news photographer. And he was a master of lighting. He did things like light a battleship in the middle of the Atlantic with flash bulbs, and Metropolitan Opera in New York, and all kinds of different things. He was also the most gentle, kind, giving soul that I had met since my first mentor. So basically, I spent my life learning from mentors, whether it was in school or out of school. And
I don't want to interrupt you, but this is perfect time, because I know you're still in your intro mode.
Oh, jeez.
But you're hitting on one of the questions that I wanted to get into, and now's the perfect time, because knowing you like I have for the last 10 plus years, one key to the way you work with clients, and I look at myself initially as I didn't know you at all. You bid on something, I came to help you with your marketing. But what are some of the things that you've looked at over the years that have been a key to relationship building? Because that's what your whole story is about. Everything you just talked about for the last few minutes was all about relationship building. And I totally understand the fun of working at a newspaper, because I used to be in the darkroom doing the engravings at the Painesville Telegraph in Ohio, which was strictly, at that time, it was strictly, everything was black and white. There were no color photographs in newspapers. USA Today didn't exist yet. But the smell and the activity and the noise of the presses and the craziness, even in a little dinky town like Painesville, Ohio, where almost nothing seemed to happen, it was exciting.
Yep.
But everything that you just said was all about relationship building. So when you look back on so many different things that you've done in your career, what are some of the keys that you found help you build those relationships every time?
Being curious, always being curious about what somebody else is doing, what somebody else is all about. And I think that was instilled in me very early on as a journalist. And it's carried me through, whether I'm doing commercial photography, annual reports, man on the street interviews, whatever. You just have to be curious of the person that you're photographing and think outside the box, and treat everybody with respect, and just go above and beyond on every job. One of the things that I was told, and I passed on to the people that worked for me when I was a photo editor: there are no bad assignments. There are only lazy photographers. And if you...
Good one.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you go out with an attitude of, this is the most important picture I'm ever going to have to make, then you're going to work 3 times harder than the next guy out there or next woman out there. And it's like, and they didn't believe me when, of course, I told them that. They just thought I was, huffing and puffing, as I often did. But I went out and proved it, because the staff hated the business page assignments. So I went out and started doing the business page assignments. But I told them, it's like, I'm going out here like I'm being paid $500,000 to do an annual report, and this is one of the one of the key pictures. Now I'm going to do a picture that is worthy of that. And I did it on every single picture. I didn't care if it was Joe Bob the plumber or if it was the CEO of whatever. I went and did it. And honestly, the most exciting, gratifying business assignment I ever got was to go into the factory in Lansing, Michigan, where my father worked, and to see what he did and to photograph it like I was photographing a story for National Geographic. And it was just something that I wanted to do, and I got to do it and made him proud that I was there doing that. But it was just attitude.
Wow.
Yeah, I use the tagline of, smile big, laugh hard, and make people happy. But that's really the case. If you can just go in, do the job, be happy about it, and make other people happy that you were there. Some people make people happy by being there. Some people make people happy by leaving. I try not to be the latter.
Love it. I love it. I love hearing about the relationship side of this because it's so important with photography. It's so much more than just picking up a camera and snapping a photo. It's just, I love these elements, but I do also want to talk about the other side of the coin because I'm curious about your take on film. In a recent blog post you said that using film makes you think, and that it's not just about exposure, but it's also about composition and timing. And I would love to hear you dive into why you love film so much.
I love film for several reasons. One is where I started. I mean, I've shot hundreds of miles of Kodak Tri-X, and I have the multiple banker boxes filled with negatives to prove it. But the wonderful thing is I look back at the negatives that I created in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and they're still there. I can still put my hands on them and look at the negatives. I have two 12 terabyte boxes, and there's a whole bunch of ones and zeros in there. I can't put my hands on any of the pictures that are in those boxes because there's nothing there to actually touch. It's just out there in the ether of cyberspace. And I like the physicality of touching my images, the hands-on. I was talking to a psychologist, not in therapy, but I used to do a lot of higher education work. So we were talking one day about the rush into technology that happens, that's happened. And she was explaining that the faster we move, the more people will try to revert back. I said, oh, well, maybe that's why for a long time I collected typewriters. And she went, aha. And I said, and then I moved to fountain pens because they were easier to carry. And now I'm shooting film, and my favorite camera is a Nikon S3 that was made in 1958. And the neat thing is, this camera that was made in 1958 is performing as well as it did in 1958.
Wow.
And I think of all the digital cameras that I've had that have come and gone and come and gone. Because I got into digital pretty early. My first professional grade digital camera was 2.4 megapixels.
Wow.
And and when they hit a whopping, or Canon came out with the, what was it, 30D, D30. I forget the nomenclature, but it was 3.4 megapixels. I said, that's it. I'm switching. So I took all my film stuff out and traded it for a pair of these Canons. And of course, some of the clients were like, yes, you've joined the technology, bandwagon. And some of them were, are you kidding me? I said, but that was a time when nobody was playing pictures up that big in the publications or the magazines I was shooting for. So it's like, okay, well, that's good enough for a full page spread, kind of, sort of, almost.
It's interesting when you talk about shooting with film, and I know I mentioned this once or twice on another podcast over the last few years, on a couple times, but I did a podcast with Mary Ellen Mark once, and she talked about when she's working with her students, she makes them put tape over the screen on their camera. She doesn't want anybody chimping, and she talked about the fact that when you're shooting film and when you're in an analog world, you take more time to get the shot. You pay more attention to everything, because when you're digital, she said what everybody does, they think they got the shot and they look down, that's great, all right, I'm time to move on. And yet she used the example of a wedding photographer, and I know I told you this when we were talking on the phone the other day, so I don't mean to repeat it to you, but or to everybody else. The point is that as a wedding photographer, for example, you got the shot of grandma and her granddaughter at the wedding, but the real shot might have been 30 seconds later when there was a tear in grandma's eye. And she talked about the fact that when you're shooting film, you pay much more attention to everything Shamir was talking about before, the exposure, the composition, how you're going to tell, how that image is going to capture the story. So I love it. I understand the return to film. I also love the fact that as part of your return to film now, you also started teaching more. Am I right?
That's correct.
And is film playing a role when you're teaching?
Well, film's playing a very subdued role, only because of certain other things. But what the thing about film is, not only, as you said, you have to wait, or it should wait. It requires patience and timing. What I see and what I experienced, which is why I finally just said no, was that I'd go out on assignments and shoot thousands of pictures because I could. And there's a great meme out there that relates to when we shot 120, we'd have 1 out of 12 pictures. When we shot 35 millimeter, we shot have 2 great pictures out of 36. And when we shot digital, we'd have 6 great pictures out of 2,000. And that's true because it's so easy to, especially when the camera manufacturers are promoting all this now, push the button and fire off like you're firing a machine gun. Pop, 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 pop. 12 frames a second, 10 frames a second. Camera come out with 60 frames a second. I mean, okay, I guess it sort of bothers me because I know that a lot of that's aimed for sports photographers. But you know what? I did a lot of sports photography at 3 frames a second, hand holding a 400 3.5 and manually focusing. And we got pictures. Now, with all this autofocus, auto shoot, everything, I guess I haven't shot sports in years, but it seems like it's just, can you hold the camera? Can you point it? The camera's doing all the work. I don't know. There's a issue of craft that kind of bothers me, and that's one of the things that I teach is to get around back to your point. But you know me You know me, Skip. I wander aimlessly.
Not so aimlessly.
Okay, but craft is still important. I teach a lot of lighting to people who are not schooled in lighting, or they've watched 3 YouTube videos, so they're knowledgeable. I love YouTube, but there's something about hands-on, which was the way I was taught. I did work for a master.
I'm going to interrupt you again. I don't mean to keep doing this, but where are you teaching, by the way? I want to get that in. If anybody is in the area, I know you're teaching somewhere around Ohio.
Yes, I'm teaching at YM Camera in Boardman, Ohio. It's one of those shops that I didn't even know existed until one of the owners, Robbie Yankish, started doing social media. And I saw, being in Pittsburgh, I didn't know about it. So I came over one day and went, gasp. This is a, camera shop with 2 floors. They ship all over the U.S. They get stuff in that some of the big boys in New York can't get in just because of the relationships that Robbie and his father, Jim, have built over decades. It's a 3rd-generation camera shop. So it's really cool to see stuff come in that, you sign on to any of the big New York shops and they, say out of stock. But we've got 3 of them. Anyway, that's where I'm teaching. And
how do people sign up if they wanted to attend one of your workshops?
They go to ymcamera.com and they can, there's a page for classes. And one of the cool things that, we started was Coffee and Cameras. It's a monthly get together. It is not a camera club. It's a bunch of camera and photo enthusiasts who get together and shoot the breeze over coffee and sometimes donuts. And people bring in pictures, we project them, we critique them, we try to help them. And sometimes I'll go so far as to take the image that they submit and do a little cropping, a little Photoshop. A couple months ago, we had a bunch of kids come in. Now, these were, I think it was 7 to 14 years old. But these kids had amazing vision. They didn't even know it. Now, some of the pictures were a little loose, so I cropped them, did a little minor adjustments in Photoshop, and made beautiful images from them. And they didn't even know they had them in there. I said, this is what you've got. You've got the eye. Just practice more. So I gave them a couple of tips on what to do, and they went out of there like they were walking on clouds. But that felt great to me because that's how I felt when I started, and that's the kind of education I got. I got my pictures critiqued. Now, granted, it was a little rougher than what I did because the times were different and the mentor was, just out of the Navy. So
you just hit on something that I want to remind all our listeners. We're going into summertime. Everybody's business is hopefully going to start picking back up again if it hasn't already. The pandemic has created just an incredible amount of stress over the last couple of years, but it's time to get out of it. But in terms of your own family, everybody listening out there, don't be afraid to put a camera in the hands of one of your kids or a grandchild. The younger they are, the more you'll start to see their perspective on the way they see the world. And especially, putting the camera in the hands of a 6-year-old, you're doing a family vacation, and make your 6-year-old the photojournalist for the trip to tell the story is an incredible education process, not just for them, but for you in the way they see the world. It's a
Yes.
very cool thing to do. And there's that old line about shoemakers' children needing shoes. I think
Hmm.
we all tend to forget with our own families that, hey, here's an opportunity to get them into imaging. Not that they want them to take over your business when you're gone, but just to tell the story.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you just described with these young teenagers that came into the shop.
Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of talent out there that either parents don't recognize because they're too close to it, or they've really never paid attention. They just think, ah, that's a kid. And the grandmother brought these kids in, and grandma's a good photographer, so she knew that these kids had a little something special, but she was really thankful that I went to the next level with these kids and really encouraged them. But again, that's how I was taught, and that's why I wanted to teach, because I think we owe something back, and it's not just providing free photography. I know that, well, that's a very big thing. I'm doing this free, okay, but do it for yourself too, and do it for the greater good, not just And I've done my share of the nonprofit or the special things, and but teaching somebody, being their mentor, it's something special.
Love
And
it.
it's really, I tell people, I get out of teaching probably more than most of my students. Because when I see somebody have an aha moment where it all just clicks, and I don't care if I'm explaining how to do a 3-light portrait or whether I'm doing, explaining the exposure triangle, something basic. When they go, they get it. And it's like, that really is satisfying to me.
Terry, I love your passion. I can hear it in your voice that you have for teaching and for inspiring people. Yeah, it's so cool. And I have one more question that I want to sneak in. We're already at the end of our interview. It's crazy how fast these things go by. It's such a good conversation. Our favorite final question, and it's always a loaded question because every single answer that we get is different. And I'm curious, and I feel like you've already touched on some points, but briefly, what advice would you have for photographers who are just starting out today?
Find somebody to learn from.
Oh, love it.
And that's somebody good. Maybe even somebody that isn't offering classes, because I see too many sign up for my classes, sign up for my presets, and all of this churning to make money. Find somebody who's got a passion in image making, in teaching, in just helping. And, I still think that the way I did it is valid today. I was just, I dogged them until they gave up. I wouldn't take no for an answer. Now, if he would have, this was a different time, but if he would have said, sure, you can come here and for $29.95 a day, you can hang out and I'll teach you. That would have been a different thing.
Right.
But and not just he, Chuck Elliott is his name, not just Chuck, but every mentor I had afterwards, he never asked for a dime, except they did set goals for me. They set a standard of excellence. They encouraged me without saying it to give back at some point. So
Love it.
I think that's how you move to the next level. Find that person that has the passion for it. and is somebody you like.
Perfect advice. I couldn't think of any better advice to wrap up this interview.
Okay.
Perfect. And I do want to make sure and ask, where can folks find your work online so they can check it out?
Oh, sure. It's very easy. TerryClark.com. www.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure to include that in the show notes, as well as a link to the workshops over at YM Camera. I looked those up, and yeah, those look like a lot of fun. So we'll include that in the show notes as well. And Skip, where can folks find you online?
It's always the same answer. Everything I write is at skipcohenuniversity.com. My email is skip@mei500.com. And you'll find me as Skip Cohen on Facebook and Skip Cohen on Twitter. And we always remind everybody we're always looking for new ideas, new guests, any topic that you'd like us to discover and share with you guys. And Shamira, same question. Where do they go to find you?
Yes, folks can send me an email at shamira@photofocus.com. That's my first name, CHAMIRA @photofocus.com. We love getting questions, ideas, and feedback because it absolutely shapes how we move forward with this show and the amazing guests that we have. And speaking of amazing, Terry, you were amazing. This was awesome. We want to thank you
Good stuff.
for being on the show.
Well, thank you. It's been fun. And it was the fastest hour I've ever seen.
Especially when it's supposed to be a 30-minute podcast.
Oh.
There you go.
Whoops.
It does
That's what
fly
we forgot
by.
to tell you.
Oh,
No, it was great.
Details.
It was wonderful. It flies by. We love it. We love it. And we want to thank our listening audience for joining us as well. Please tell your friends about this podcast, especially if they have the burning desire to improve their photography business. We look forward to having you all with us next time on the Mind Your Own Business podcast, brought to you by Photofocus and Skip Cohen University.